Good afternoon and welcome to Midday Report here on TVP World. I'm your host, Marie Caso. A Russian oil tanker currently named the Marinera has become yet another point of contention between the US and Russia. Earlier this week, the American Coast Guard attempted to seize the tanker, which prompted Moscow to deploy Navy assets, including a submarine.
Washington and Moscow are now at odds at sea, all because of an oil tanker that has historically carried Venezuelan crude oil. In December, Donald Trump ordered a blockade of sanctioned vessels to and from Venezuela. At the time, the U.S. Coast Guard attempted to board this oil tanker in the Caribbean when it was suspected of approaching Venezuela. But then the ship took a dramatic turn, ending up near Iceland on Tuesday.
As this is progressing and the vessel is not being declaring the next destination, the main speculation is that the vessel is heading to Russia. Since the vessel officially was not loaded with any cargo, the only thing that we can imagine is that the vessel was carrying something that the Russians don't want to be presented.
As the ship was making its way through the ocean, it changed its name from Bella 1 to Marinera and the flag it was flying. Officially first registered under Panama, then flying a false Guyana flag, the tanker is now sailing under a Russian flag, accompanied by Moscow's naval vessels, and continuing to attract a lot of international attention.
Probably the US authorities, they do have their internal information about what actually the vessel is carrying. So we can talk either about weapons, we can talk about narcotics, we can talk about main stuff over here, since actually they have spent a lot of time and effort in order to come on board on the vessel.
The development spanning the Atlantic takes place after the U.S. captured Venezuela's former leader Nicolas Maduro on Saturday. Against this backdrop, comments made in 2019 by Fiona Hill, former advisor to Donald Trump, resurfaced, with the official implying that Russia was willing to withdraw its support for Maduro, letting U.S. act as it wished in Venezuela in exchange for a free hand in Ukraine. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabishchan.
Venezuela has agreed to transfer up to 50 billion barrels of oil to the U.S., worth $2 billion, effectively caving to pressure from the Trump administration. This could help alleviate the economic effects of the U.S.'s naval blockade. The Venezuelan government's decision comes as its new president launches a wave of repression and curbs on civil liberties.
Going to run the country until
U.S. President Donald Trump has scored another victory against Venezuela.
Transition, so
I am pleased to announce that the interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America.
Already, a flotilla of U.S. oil tankers is on its way to the South American country to begin loading vast quantities of oil that have been stranded at the country's ports due to a U.S. naval blockade imposed last month. Experts have warned that Venezuelan oil production could collapse if the blockade isn't lifted in the coming days, potentially falling as low as 300,000 barrels per day. For comparison, that's below record lows set in 2020 during the pandemic. Production peaked at nearly 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1990s before collapsing in the decades since. It stands today at just over 1 million barrels.
It used to be a rich country, exporting around 3 million barrels of oil daily, producing 3 million barrels of oil daily. Now it produces around 1 million due to sanctions, due to economic repercussions of sanctions, underinvestments, and so on.
A renewed collapse in oil production would plunge Venezuela's economy back into crisis, causing more hardship for the country's nearly 30 million residents.
Oil still accounts for more than half of Venezuela's fiscal input, so the further blockade can have a very large impact on Venezuela's budget. It can ruin a country completely.
And since Maduro's capture by U.S. forces on Saturday, everyday life already appears to be getting worse. To snuff out any support for the U.S. intervention, the government of interim President Delcy Rodriguez has enacted measures to curb public expression among citizens and journalists and deployed paramilitary groups in the capital, Caracas. But at the same time, the new president is treading carefully with the United States, reluctantly cooperating with some of Donald Trump's demands.
Delcy Rodriguez is speaking for cooperation with American companies in oil sector. So even if there is no real change in power in Venezuela, you can imagine that American companies are entering Venezuelan market once again.
And in the meantime, unrelenting pressure by the U.S. could make an already precarious situation for Venezuela even worse. Maciej Wilowski for TVP World.
European allies are working on plans for a response to a potential U.S. move on Greenland. The French foreign minister has said he will discuss these plans with his Polish and German counterparts in Paris today. And joining me from Paris is our correspondent Alex Cadier. Good afternoon, Alex. There's been a flurry of diplomacy in the French capital over the last 24 hours. How have American threats over Greenland been received?
Yeah, that's right, Marie. Of course, we had the leaders of the coalition, the willing of 35 countries here in Paris in the last 24 hours. And of course, this news about Greenland coming out of Washington met with some degree of consternation. But it has to be said, a desire, at least from French officials I've been speaking to keep calm and carry on, to not lose their cool over threats of military intervention by the United States in Greenland. Now, the French officials I was speaking to in the last day or so were saying, look, we are going to focus on what we were here to do, which was, of course, to provide support for Ukraine, to coordinate with the United States on those efforts. But we have heard from the French foreign minister just this morning, Jean-Noël Bardot, who was saying that he will discuss plans to shore up Greenland with Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, with his German counterpart here in Paris today in that meeting. Now, of course, Jean-Noël Bardot had to rule out that the U.S. would invade Greenland. He said that he spoke to Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, saying that that was not the plan. We've heard other Trump officials saying that the U.S. wants to buy Greenland, but nevertheless, there is certainly a joint statement we saw from the French president, the Polish prime minister, and 5 other leaders. I should say 6 other leaders, clearly saying that Greenland's sovereignty cannot be threatened in any way, shape or form. Clearly, a quite extraordinary situation that the French foreign minister has to rule out a U.S. invasion of a NATO ally in Denmark. So there will be these discussions. European powers will have to find a way to at least de-escalate the situation, if not figure out a plan to react to it, Marie.
Well, it's a developing story, and I'm sure that you will keep us updated as the hours go on. That was Alex Cadier joining us from Paris. Many thanks. So, as we just heard from our correspondent, Alex Cadier, European leaders are planning a response to the potential U.S. takeover of Greenland. The European message is clear. Washington's military seizure of Greenland would not only deepen the divide between the U.S. and Europe, but also trigger shockwaves through NATO. We expect to know more following the meeting of the foreign ministers of the Weimar Triangle countries, Poland, France and Germany, that will take place in Paris this afternoon. Poland will be represented by its Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radosław Sikorski. TVP World is following this developing story and will keep you updated.
The US has doubled down on its determination to gain control of this icy Arctic island. The White House said on Tuesday night that Donald Trump has discussed using military force over the Danish territory.
The president and his team are discussing a range of options to pursue this important foreign policy goal, and of course, utilizing the U.S. military is always an option at the commander-in-chief's disposal.
The talk of military might comes after Saturday's assault on Caracas, which saw Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro deposed. Trump sees acquiring Greenland as a national security priority, necessary to deter adversaries in the Arctic region.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place.
Denmark's foreign minister says that isn't true and has asked to meet US Secretary of State Marco Rubio to set the record straight.
It is not a totally correct picture, to say it very, very diplomatically, and therefore we think it makes sense to try and have a meeting with our American counterpart in order to solve some of the misunderstandings that may be there.
Rubio may be looking to downplay talk of military action over Greenland. According to the Wall Street Journal, Rubio has told US lawmakers that recent threats against the territory do not signal an imminent invasion, and that the goal is to buy the island from Denmark. Talk of military action against NATO member Denmark has not gone down well on Capitol Hill.
I don't see military action being an option there.
I continue to hope the administration's rhetoric on Greenland is nothing more than posturing for a new era of cooperation, because any effort to claim or take the territory by force would degrade both our national security and our international relationships.
The US made a specific commitment, recognizing the sovereignty of Denmark over Greenland and agreeing not to object to the extension of Danish political and economic interests there when purchasing the Virgin Islands from Copenhagen in 1916. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said on Wednesday that EU allies are working on a plan on how to respond should the US act on its threat to take over Greenland, and that the matter would be raised at a meeting with the foreign ministers of Germany and Poland later in the day.
The controversial EU-Mercosur trade deal appears to be one step closer to becoming reality after the EU gained Italy's support on Tuesday. Rome initially opposed the deal, but appears to have been persuaded by the European Commission's proposal to accelerate 45 billion euros of support for farmers. According to Italian Agriculture Minister Francesco Brigitte, the European Union is now proposing to increase spending on Italian agriculture rather than to cut it. This coming Friday, the Executive Commission overseeing the deal hopes to gain a majority of 15 member states, representing 65% of the EU population. The Mercosur deal has met strong opposition from farmers across Europe, who worry that a flood of cheap agricultural imports produced under the more relaxed environmental and agricultural standards of some South American countries will put them under too much pressure. French film star, style icon and animal rights activist Brigitte Bardot has been laid to rest today with a private service in Saint-Tropez. She passed away at the age of 91 on December 28th from cancer after undergoing 2 surgeries.
Saint-Tropez says adieu to French film icon Brigitte Bardot.
We are arranging to decorate the church as requested with very simple country-style flowers. After that, we have been honored with the task of making her coffin cover.
The animal rights activist and controversial political figure passed away 10 days ago at the age of 91 at her home in southern France. Today, residents of Saint-Tropez are invited to accompany the funeral procession and pay their final respects.
She was very approachable, so we saw her around the neighborhood regularly. She was very kind and always smiling. What I remember most is her lifelong sacrifice, ending her career very early to dedicate herself to animal rights.
Born in 1934 into a wealthy Parisian family, Brigitte Anne-Marie Bardot trained as a ballerina. By the age of 16, she was already one of Paris's most famous cover girls, soon catching the attention of filmmakers. And her international breakthrough came in 1956 with And God Created Woman, filmed in Saint-Tropez by her then-husband, director Roger Vadim. The film challenged social norms and redefined female sensuality on screen, turning Bardot into a global sensation. But at the height of her fame, Bardot made an unexpected choice. At just 38, she left the film industry behind, devoting her life to animal rights activism.
I'm very much for the animal cause, so it's a woman I admire very much for everything she's done. She's an icon.
Once one of the most photographed women in the world, Brigitte Bardot, or Bébé, as the French like to call her, will be laid to rest in a cemetery overlooking the Mediterranean Sea.
And that's all for Midday Report. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more on TVP World. Goodbye.